Okay, folks, just a quick video about digitizing terracing. As I mentioned in class, the goal here is to digitize all the terracing in this area of the valley so that we can use it as training data for a convolutional neural network. And so what we're doing is we're classifying different kinds of field systems in the imagery. We could break it down into two general categories around use, whether something is in use or abandoned, and then which field types we're talking about, which terrace types we're talking about, and how to identify them in the imagery. So first, in use versus abandoned. Um, so basically we're looking at whether something is being actively maintained. It may not have a field, it may not have a crop growing in it at this moment, but we can tell whether it's in use in the sense that it's being actively maintained. And that's basically a textural issue. We can tell by looking at them whether they're in use or not. So if I zoom in here a little bit, I'll just show you some in-use terracing against abandoned terracing. Okay, so if I zoom into this area, clearly this stuff here is in use, right? It's being actively cultivated and maintained, and we can tell this by the crispness of these walls. These are field divider walls between them. These are rock-faced terraces. These are terrace facings themselves. Now this particular area is kind of degraded, so it's a good place to talk about abandoned versus unabandoned. It's actually more of a continuum. So these are unabandoned, in other words, they're in use, but they're kind of degraded. In other words, what happens is terrace faces can collapse over time. They need to be actively maintained because the water pressure builds up from the irrigation water that comes down. It can seep behind the terrace face, and the hydraulic pressure from behind can actually push out the terrace facing. That happens a lot, and other natural processes cause the terrace to slowly fall apart basically over time. So in some cases, so what's happening basically, what we're seeing is a social process by which households themselves often have a hard time maintaining these large infrastructure aspects, right? Where above the household level, if you can aggregate labor to a higher scale, then you can maintain these big systems. So what happens in the colonial era is a lot of those social systems begin to break down because of demographic decline, right? Because the population is crashing, the labor pool is shrinking, and there's all kinds of social disruption as a consequence of Spanish colonialism in the Andes, right? So that's why we see abandonment, complete abandonment, which is what's going on up here. You can tell there was terracing, there is terracing, but it's clearly not being maintained. It's really, you can just see fragments of the walls. You can more or less make out the extent of this terrace complex. It probably runs up to about here. But it's clearly abandoned as opposed to this stuff down here, which is being actively maintained. Okay, I'll zoom into some other areas just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. This stuff down, this is a river right here, the Colca River. So this is the low spot, so we're going up slope. These terraces are all being actively maintained, obviously. And all these fields, these are technically, hydrologically speaking, terraces also. They're just really broad terraces. So all these surfaces in the valley are sort of optimized by people to towards hydraulic management, towards irrigation management. So they're all basically graded very slightly, like to a 1 to 2 degree incline, or sometimes a little more, but they're sort of optimized for the flow of water. So you see, even in these valley bottom fields, as we call them, they're actually very subtly terraced to optimize for the flow of water over there, so that you don't have soil erosion and you don't have just water sitting on the surface. Okay, so up here, these are all actively maintained. Then up here, you can see more abandoned field systems along here. These are different types, okay, but clearly some abandoned field systems in there, and these upper slopes. And that's generally the pattern we're seeing is upper slopes we see abandonment, and that makes sense because those would have been the more marginal environments, microclimates. We're at nearly 4,000 meters here. We're at 38, the town of Tuti right here is at 3,850 meters approximately. So that's, whatever that is, that's about 11,800 feet or something like that. So we're talking really high altitude. We're at the edge of what many even Andean crops that are adapted by people to high altitude, the upper limit of where those can be productively cultivated or at least reliably cultivated. So, you know, what we're seeing then is people cutting their losses with the more marginal lands, and abandoning certain terrace complexes. Okay, so that as far as field types, then the second part, so you can think of them all again as basically variants of terrace systems. So we have this typological scheme. We have several types of terraces that are categories that are not hard and fast. The boundaries between the categories are gray, so it's not like there's a black and white answer as to what a given terrace complex is in terms of these categories. But usually we can agree on some characteristics. Okay, so the first and the most common are bench terraces like these here, which are narrow terraces with narrow facings, or I'm sorry, narrow surfaces, top surfaces, and pretty high terrace walls, and they're on steep slopes, right? So what they're doing there again is they're cutting into the slope for a foundation for the wall, then they're infilling behind it to create a stable planting surface and hydrological surface. So the tops of these terraces slightly slope towards the downslope, and the irrigation water comes down, and they can guide the water over each terrace, and it cascades down to the next one, and so forth as you go down. Okay, so those are bench terraces, these kind of narrow ones. And then there's another category called broad field terraces, which are sort of transitional, where like this I would call a broad field terrace. Looking for some other ones here. These are broad field terraces. So they're just wider, and they're usually at the base of steep slopes, right? So that category is pretty slippery. It doesn't have real hard boundaries around it. Okay, so don't worry about that too much, but in some areas you may get a clear case of broad field terraces. If I move up valley here, these are what we call valley bottom fields, which are actually terraces also, as I say, but they're just really broad, and they're on these flat plains, what are called pampas in the Andes. This is a broad alluvial terrace here, and you've got these really large fields. These are also irrigated. Okay, and these are all in use also. Okay, so broad fields, valley bottom fields. I'm sorry, valley bottom fields. Okay, so then there's one other category that we talk about, which really aren't in use at all anymore, so they're almost always abandoned, and that's sloping fields. So that's what these are here. These are sort of embankments that were built into the side of the hill, and the planting surfaces were actually sloped. So this was a way and these were probably unirrigated in the sense that they didn't have canal systems running to them. So they would divert these natural drainages over into these little planting surfaces created by these walls that they built. So those are called sloping fields. You can see in this case there's some modern modification going on. There's probably tree plantings that they put in. But anyway, so you've got modern use over an abandoned field system. So we would categorize this as abandoned sloping fields. Okay, so we've got in use and abandoned, and there's a third category which is there's sort of a third category which is in use but degraded. which means that it's sort of collapsed terraces that people haven't been able to really rebuild, but that they're using anyway. This is sort of like that. This is sort of degraded. This is sort of degraded. So what happens is the terrace kind of collapses and you end up with a sort of mounded uh, slope here, and they've sort of made do with what was left over, right? So it's a sort of degraded terrace system. Again, that's sort of an index of essentially like economic hardship where people can't, in this community, and so at least some households are not able to actively rebuild terraces that have collapsed, right? So I'm looking for other examples. There's some other examples of degraded. Here's some here. These are sort of collapsed terraces that people are still doing something with. It's not like it's completely abandoned. They may be using it kind of for a low intensity thing like pasturage. So they may just be putting like alfalfa, or sometimes they'll put tuna cactus, so prickly pear cactus. Not at these altitudes, but in other parts of the valley they'll do that. So that sort of thing where they're making use of the planting surfaces, but they're not actively maintaining the terraces. So they're sort of degraded terraces. Okay, that is pretty much it. I've got some other categories where, if you've got an area that you've traced in where it's mostly in use with just a few abandoned, there's a category for that. And then the inverse of that, mostly abandoned with maybe one or two terraces in use. But basically what you want to do is trace in not individual terraces, you want to trace in terrace complexes. So that's, again, also an area where it's a little bit subjective. But you should be able to kind of see what we're up to here in that regard. So these are all traced in already, obviously, so you can kind of see what we're doing. So let me change this symbology just a little bit so you can see the edges a little bit better. Just going to put a white border on this. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so these are all labeled as bench terraces, and people are putting the boundaries on major dividers. Oftentimes these will be canals. Like I would actually move that. We're going to revise all this, but I would put the boundary more like here rather than over here. Okay, so but the main point being we're putting in whole complexes and not individual terraces like this. Okay, so here's a whole complex here. So again, a little bit of a judgment call, like you can put this line up here to include this little terrace. There's another complex here of sort of degraded bench terracing. That's actually a soccer field right there. These are valley bottom fields, and the whole area here. The important thing is to only include the walls of the fields or the terraces, and don't include like this is a path that runs between them. So if I turn this off for a second, you'll see more clearly. Like these are paths that run down to get out to the fields. This is a building here. We could actually, eventually we'll probably go around this building, right? Because we don't want the AI to think that this thing is part of a field system necessarily. Like here we did trace around the building, okay? Okay, so that's pretty much it. So remember, just the steps are toggle editing, then you're going to add a polygon, right? Trace your polygon, right click for the last point. It won't set that last point. Like the shape of this polygon is going to be rectangular. I'm just going to right click, and then you fill out the attribute form. The polygon disappears until you finish filling out the attribute form. Confidence is on a scale of 1 to 5. How confident are you in the identification of the type? The use state is in use, or in use degraded, or abandoned, in antiquity. Okay, so most of the stuff that we're saying is abandoned. You just mark it as in antiquity. It means it was abandoned a long time ago. Okay, we don't really know when. It's clearly been abandoned for a while. Then there are these other categories you probably don't need to worry about too much. So this is in use. Notes if you want to make some sort of observations about your identification, okay? And then put your name here. I'm going to double check this list and make sure everybody's name is on it, but I'm going to put my name there. The date will autofill. And let me see, put something for, I'm just going to put NA here right now, okay, and press OK. Okay, so that's done. So now let's say if you want to edit it, if I want to edit the shape, I would choose the vertex tool. I can add a vertex here. I can snap it over to this one. I can add a, see where you have two vertices in a polygon, the center point you can add a point to and then move it around, and so on. So let's say I'm done. So I'm done editing that. Okay, so I'll save my edits, stop editing. You don't have to do it after every polygon, but save the edits at least after every polygon. Now if you want to select a whole polygon, you just use the selection tool, which is in this toolbar here. Oops. Just use the selection tool. You can just click on the whole polygon and I can hit delete and delete it. Okay. Now if I want to edit attributes after I've already closed the form that pops up, you just go, you select what you want to edit, and you can go to modify attributes of all selected features, or you can go to the attribute table this way, right? So, but this is sort of a shortcut, right? And then you can get to the form this way. That's pretty cool. Or you can go attribute table, right? Here's the attribute table that form fills out for it when you fill out that form. And then you can switch this to show selected features, and it'll just show this one line that corresponds to that, and make any edits you're going to make, right? And so on and so forth. So that's it. So don't worry about doing the architecture, the structures that are mentioned. I said to do 10 buildings. Don't worry about doing that. We're just going to focus on the terracing. So just do 10, at least 10 polygons. Would be great if you could do more, because you're creating real data, real training data for this project. So the more you can do, the better. But 10 is the only requirement for the assignment. All right, thanks.